Code Geass has always been pretty important to me. It was one of the first shows that I really kind of went out of my way to watch because it was anime rather than watching something and it just happening to be anime. So it's always been something I valued pretty highly. In addition to just really enjoying it when I first watched it back in December of 2012, which is over 10 years ago. It's been a long time. And I really wanted to try and rewatch it before the 10-year mark came and went, much like when I rewatched Soul Eater, right in time so that I did get through it before it hit 10 years. The same couldn't happen for Code Geass. Unfortunately, it just kept getting pushed back, and I only ended up getting to rewatch it a few weeks ago. So, more than 10 years, but hey, what can you do? At least I've rewatched it. Also, kind of similarly to Soul Eater, it's a show that I've had on Blu-ray for quite a while, only about 5 years compared to the 8 years for Soul Eater, and I just didn't get around to rewatching it. But finally I have, and I had some concerns before I went into it. Mostly because in the years since I first saw it, despite how much I really, really adored it at the time, I have naturally been exposed to differing opinions. And despite how generally well-liked and regarded Code Geass is, it definitely has its detractors. And having been around said detractors and seeing their opinions and just general dislike for Code Geass and its writing style, it always kind of made me wonder if I was overvaluing the show because I watched it so early on. And I kind of had this fear in the back of my head that if I did sit down and go through it again, that I would find new problems that I didn't see originally, and that even problems that I did have when I first watched the show would somehow be worse. So that was something that really concerned me. Maybe it was something that encouraged me to sort of push off watching it again because I didn't want my view of it to be shattered. But I am the kind of person who, after a certain amount of time, in this case over a decade, I do want to kind of reinforce my opinions on shows that I've seen in the past and make sure, A, that I still like them the same amount, and B, sort of help to justify their position in my own personal ranking of anime compared to newer shows. Because I do kind of wonder sometimes if I don't put newer shows as high as they should be, because I don't want to put them above older shows, and it makes me wonder if I'm giving them a certain level of bias. But anyway, I did sit down and rewatched all 50 episodes of Code Geass, and I have to say, I'm very, very pleasantly surprised that I still really adore this show. And in fact, a lot of the things I was worried about that I thought I would have problems with, I really didn't. If anything, I feel like I have fewer problems with the show overall than I did back in 2012, which is strange to think about. That's not to say that I think the show is perfect. That's not to say I think it's flawless. But I definitely thought I would see more holes in its fabric than there were. And mainly this was with R2. I really thought I would have a lot more problems with Season 2. I always liked Season 1 more, and I would still say Season 1 edges out Season 2. But whereas I would have said prior to this rewatch that Season 2 was a step down from Season 1, I wouldn't say that anymore. I think they are pretty equivalent in quality. Even if I would say, gun to my head, I have to pick one, I would pick R1. I still think R2 is a really fantastic season. And things that I thought would bother me, for example, just to throw this out, Rolo, right? And I will go into spoilers. If you have not seen Code Geass, somehow, if you haven't seen it, stop the video, go watch it. I mean, you owe it to yourself to at least check the show out and then come back to this. So Rolo, right? Rolo has a reputation of not being a very well-regarded character. Maybe not to the same extent as someone like Nina, but a lot of people don't like Rolo. And I remembered not caring for Rolo all that much when I first saw the show. but I think he's pretty inoffensive. Yes, of course, he kills Shirley, and we can talk about that in a little bit, but he's really not an annoying character, and I actually feel somewhat sympathetic for him, you know, having remembered like what his backstory is and what his deal is. Like, he's definitely not like on the same level as like Nina. He is not like that bad of a character. I think he's fine. He's not the deepest character in the show or anything, but he's definitely not like horrible or even bad. I think he's just fine. He's a pretty all right character. And even though he does kill Shirley, it's something that like doesn't come out of nowhere. It makes sense for him to do that. And like, it's not like he gets off scot-free, right? He does die in the end. Granted, it's not like Lelouch gets his revenge on him. Like, he dies by his own hand trying to save Lelouch. But it's not like the show just says, oh, it's okay that Rollo did this. Like, Rollo still, in some way, kind of pays for what he did, right? And while, yes, I can understand if someone would look at the whole situation with him and Shirley and Lelouch and be like, well, should he have, like, had, I don't know if I'd say a positive sort of death, but, like, one where Lelouch isn't cursing his name at the end. But I think with how events progress in those few episodes where you have Lelouch deciding, okay, I have to avenge Shirley and deal with Rollo, but then everything happens with the Flea, and Lelouch thinking Nonnally is dead, and then Lelouch lashing out at Rollo, and the Black Knight's betraying him. Like, I think it all plays out well enough where I don't think, because it's not like Lelouch, like, forgives Rollo. It's not like Lelouch is like, okay, Rollo, everything is great now. He still, like, doesn't like that Rollo killed Shirley, of course. I don't think he ever forgives Rollo. But I think it's sort of, like, maybe balances his opinion on Rollo a little bit, because despite everything, Rollo was still there to keep him alive, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think it's that weird. Because it's not like Lelouch is just, okay, Rollo, I don't care anymore that you killed Shirley. And it's not like Lelouch really had that much time to reevaluate his opinion on Rollo anyway. Regardless, like, I think it's fine. I think Rollo's fine. Shirley herself and Shirley's death, I'm not, like, super convinced needed to happen. I don't hate it. And I think, like, in a vacuum, if you just look at the scene and how it's directed, it's a very well done death scene, and I think it is fitting for the character given everything she's gone through, but I don't know if it needed to happen. I can understand someone looking at that and feeling like it's not satisfying, like Shirley maybe doesn't get avenged, but again, like, Rollo still ends up dead by the end, and even so, like, her death is still relevant in a sense, because it puts Lelouch in this weird frame of mind where he's not really thinking straight, and then you couple that with the incident in the Tokyo settlement with the Flea, and Lelouch thinking Nonnally's dead too, and it helps to kind of break Lelouch while Schneisel is trying to manipulate the Black Knights and everything. Like, I think it works out, and I think Lelouch is lashing out at Rollo because of Rollo killing Shirley is probably what pushes Rollo to kind of double down, ironically, on wanting to protect Lelouch. And it leads to him being in the nightmare and rescuing Lelouch when the Black Knights are turning on him. Like, I think it works out and still serves a purpose. But you probably could have written it where Shirley didn't need to die if you really wanted to. And I guess that is what the recap movies do, though I think that's mostly born out of a desire to, like, cut out the Mao stuff, to trim things down. If you cut out the Mao stuff, then it doesn't really make sense to kill Shirley, because then you're not going to have her getting mind wiped and everything. But I digress. If there is one thing that I still really don't like, that I also did not like when I first watched it, it is the episode where the Black Knights turn on Lelouch. Not because the concept of it is bad, and I do think it's something that probably needed to happen, because after what happens with Euphemia, it feels logical that eventually that would get out and they would turn on Lelouch, right? Even though it was an accident, you would think that with all the people who got killed, once they learn about Geass and learn about what really happened with Euphemia, that they would have a bone to pick with Lelouch, right? So I don't think the idea of them turning on him is a bad one, and I don't think it comes out of nowhere, but I almost feel like the way it's handled is still a bit too rushed. and it makes the Black Knights kind of look like a bunch of idiots, because what do, right? Schneisel shows up, and they basically just buy everything Schneisel is saying. And some of what he's saying is true, and he has some, maybe not the best proof, but he has sort of some proof, right? And then he slips in some lies as well, because he can, and the Black Knights just believe everything he says, despite the fact that he's the second prince of the Empire they are trying to defeat. They've now, formed the UFN and gotten all these other countries to join, not just with the goal of liberating Japan, but with the goal of taking down Britannia, right? And they just kind of like, oh yeah, I'm just going to believe everything Schneisel says. Even though it doesn't present it like they're turning their back on the UFN, the fact that they cut that deal with Schneisel, like, oh, we'll turn in lelouch, we'll turn our back on him and betray him if you guarantee Japan's independence. It's like, okay, but one, you're not dealing with the Emperor. And they don't know that the Emperor is so disinterested and focused on, Sea's world and everything, that he would be okay with Schneisel just authorizing Japan's independence, right? But you really think you're going to keep the UFN together if now you're striking this deal with Britannia and basically saying, yeah, we're done, we're fine now because we got Japan back? I don't know, I'm sure some countries in the UFN would be fine with that, but I think a lot of others would say, hey, aren't we going to do more than this? It just feels like they're not seeing the bigger picture and they're just kind of being dopes. I don't know, I think it could have been written better, and I don't think the idea of it is bad, but I'm not sure I'm convinced that it feels like a natural escalation of things. It does feel a little forced at the moment that it happens and in the way that it happens, just because they knew they needed to have it happen, and they had other stuff they needed to do and just kind of needed to get it over with. I'm also not entirely convinced that none of the high-ranking Black Knights members would side with lelouch instead, right? Obviously, the entire Black Knights organization doesn't know what really happened because they lie and say that Zero was killed in the battle. So most members of the Black Knights just think that that's the case, right? They don't know anything. It's only the highest ranking members who know that he's lelouch and know what happened. So it makes sense that you wouldn't have this massive split in the Black Knights because most of them don't know what really happened. But you would think that some of the high-ranking members would side with lelouch. Colin, I really feel probably should have just stuck with him, but I feel the show didn't want that to happen because they knew they wanted lelouch and Suzaku to team up. And because Suzaku and Colin had that rivalry, they probably wanted to maintain that, and having the two of them on the same side wouldn't make sense. So I don't know. I feel logically she probably should have gone with lelouch, but I also feel the show knew what it wanted and felt like it had to write things to achieve that rather than things feeling supernatural with that episode. It's just, if there's anything I want to complain about with Code Geass, it's that. I just don't think that was written the best. And that episode back in 2012 and now still leaves a weird taste in my mouth. Despite that, I really do think that season 2 is a very fantastic season, even with that issue. The fact that everything else with it, I think, is pretty equivalent to the quality of season 1. It helps to kind of get the idea that there's something wrong with the show and wrong with the writing kind of out of my head. And generally, I think the writing is very strong. One of the things that I often see people complain about is lelouch's plans and feeling like they're too unrealistic or that lelouch is too OP. I would argue the opposite. I really feel like the show kind of goes out of its way to make it clear that lelouch is not ridiculously smart all of the time. Obviously he's very smart and he's very cunning and he's very good at planning. But a lot of the time, especially when he's first starting out, he makes mistakes. He may get some victories, but he often makes a lot of mistakes either because he's underestimating his opponent, which granted, they're also often underestimating him, or he's just not accounting for something, which in most cases is Suzaku and the Lancelot. But while he does get some complete victories, right, especially as the show goes on, he also has a lot of half victories where he gets some of what he wants, but not everything. And even some complete losses, right? He's not infallible. He's not perfect. He makes a lot of mistakes. I think it helps to make him not appear as this crazy, always OP, always knowing everything kind of character. He does fail to account for things, and he does get punished for it at various points in the show. And I appreciate that. Another thing I do greatly appreciate about Lelouch is, like, unlike a lot of these anti-hero kinds of characters, right? At least anti-heroes of this type, sort of like a Light Yagami type character who is, like, doing really kind of messed up things, but because they think they have a noble goal in mind, usually those characters just get corrupted, right? They become genuinely just evil people by the end, like Light Yagami, right? With Code Geass, they're very careful with Lelouch not to have him become like that, not to have him be too corrupted. He does do plenty of evil, morally bad things, but it's always with his goal in mind. He never loses sight of his goal to protect Nonali and try to make the world a better place. And deep down, he always knows, like, he is going to have to answer for the shit he's doing. He's going to have to answer for bad means he's using to accomplish good ends. And ultimately, he does, right? He pays for it with his life, and he knows that from the get-go. Like, he is going to have to be punished for what he has done. But he's willing to do all that because he believes the goal is worth it. And you don't have to agree with that. You don't have to like it, of course. You don't have to be someone who relates to Lelouch, but it keeps Lelouch from being just this irredeemable evil character like Light ultimately ends up being. Like, you can still, in some way, want to see what happens with this character because you want to see them in some way succeed. Whereas with Light, it's like, eventually you just want to see him get taken down, and because he deserves it, and you don't want to see him succeed ultimately. It's a very distinct and important difference between those two characters. And did you know, just a bit of a tangent, Death Note and Code Geass not only came out in the same year, they were airing at the same time. Season 1 of Code Geass and Death Note, the exact same season, fall 2006. I never realized that. That is so strange that these two shows that are always compared to each other were airing at literally the same time, but I digress. Another character I really want to talk about is Suzaku. Suzaku is a character that I think gets the short end of the stick in terms of characters in the show, not like because the show mishandles him, but because fans don't really value Suzaku all that well. And I didn't really have a terribly strong opinion on Suzaku before this rewatch, but I definitely have a more positive opinion of him now. Suzaku is an interesting character because very early on, because of what he does, where he kills his father because he wants to stop the war and he wants to preserve as many people alive as he can and bring about peace and stop death and everything. Because of that, because he ends up at a very early age deciding, I want to achieve this end, so I'm going to do an evil means, that causes him, through most of season 1, right, to be the opposite kind of person. He's very much so like the opposite of Lelouch. He is so laser focused on the means at the cost of the end, right? He wants to do everything the right way through the system without doing anything too problematic, with just the hope that eventually, if he gets high up enough in the rankings in the Britannian military, right, and eventually his goal is like, hey, if I become Knight of One or something, that he'll be able to change things and make things better and achieve a good end through really noble means. But he's so laser focused on it that he ends up he comes off kind of like naive in a sense because of that. But nevertheless, it's a goal that you can understand once you learn what he did and why he is so, traumatized by what he did with his father. And it makes sense. It makes sense that because of that trauma, he just is so determined to care about the means more than the ends, care about the methods more than the results, right? Lelouch, of course, is the opposite. He will do all these evil things because it will achieve a noble end, right? And that's why they are such nice foils for each other. But as the show goes on, you see Suzaku more and more, without him really realizing it, become more like Lelouch, where ultimately it culminates where he's trying to use refrain on Colin to get information out of her. And he finally realizes, like, oh crap, I am valuing the ends more than the means. And he finally kind of snaps back a little bit, not all the way to where he was in season 1, but to a point where he's like, okay, I cannot be so laser focused on the means, but I can't be like Lelouch, like Zero, and only focus on the ends. Like, he kind of moderates himself and finds a good middle ground where he's still going to care about the means, but he's also going to care about the ends and try to value them both, rather than one significantly more so than the other, right? And I like that. I like that he kind of goes from one extreme to the other, catches himself, and kind of brings himself into a comfortable middle point, right? I think it's a very underrated character growth. And ultimately, I think that's why he is willing to team up with Lelouch at the end. In addition to, hey, the Zero Requiem allows him to avenge Euphemia because he kills Lelouch, and Lelouch's awful reputation overrides Euphemia's awful reputation in the end. So, like, he gets a lot of what he wants by teaming up with Lelouch. But, like, Suzaku in season 1 would never have done that. The only reason Suzaku is able to do that is because of the character growth he's gone through. Where now he's like, okay, this may not be, the most ideal of means, but it's a good enough means to achieve a good end, right? So I think it's appropriate that he teams up with Lelouch in the end. And I also think it's a very satisfying resolution to his character arc. So I think Suzaku is a very underrated character. And just to mention a couple other characters, because Code Geass has a lot of characters, and a lot of them are just kind of there filling their roles. And that's fine, not every character needs to be deep. But I do want to acknowledge C2 and Colin, not because they're the most deep, although they do go through character growth in terms of being more accepting of the people they're around, and in C2's case, not wanting to get killed. But I think these two characters, like, I've gained a stronger appreciation for them because of the dialogue they have, how well acted they are. Kate Higgins and Karen Strassman do a very good job. And just because of the way they play off the other characters, especially Lelouch, right? Like C2's banter with Lelouch, Colin's banter with Lelouch, even C2 and Colin's banter with each other. Like, they all have very strong dialogue with each other. And it makes them very memorable and likable characters, even if they're not as impactful as, like, Lelouch and Suzaku and don't go through as much growth. They're still incredibly likable, and it's helped me be reminded of how great they are and how much I appreciate them as characters. So overall, I ended up coming away from this rewatch with Code Geass with even more of an appreciation for the show and even more of just adoration for the show than I thought I would have had. Despite the fact that I went into this thinking I might end up liking it less, I ended up liking it way more and appreciating things that I didn't initially appreciate, which is what you want out of a rewatch. You want to ideally gain more and pick up on things that you missed initially and analyze things in a different way than you did initially. So overall, I am incredibly satisfied with my experience going through the show again. It may have taken 10 years to do it, but I think it was worth it. Thank you for watching and listening to me ramble about this show for over 20 minutes, it seems like, but I hope that if you haven't seen Code Geass, that you do give it a watch. I'd be surprised if you haven't at least tried it. But even if you have, and it's been a while, try it again. I think you might get something out of it that you didn't initially. Take care, and I'll see you all next time.